So hello to you all, and thank you for coming, and thank you to B for inviting me to present some of my work at INCISE on this occasion. I feel honored. I'm especially grateful to B for befriending me at a very odd conference in Korea, where we met a while ago. B quickly forgave an insult about their identity that inadvertently slipped out of my mouth when we first met. Perhaps it was my jet lag, but when we introduced ourselves, I mistook B for an American. I apologize again. I will speak for about 45 minutes and then look forward to your questions and comments. I titled this piece of work, Queer Theory Meets Critical Religion. Are we starting to think yet? I don't think the second part arrived. And that might be good because that title is derived, perhaps with a bit of pretension, are we starting to think yet? But certainly with a lot of aspiration from Heidegger, who once remarked, what is most thought-provoking is that we are still not thinking. Both sex and religion are terms used to refer to important and obvious characteristics of individuals, groups, countries, and cultures. However, if we think about the words carefully, a cloud of uncertainty surrounds the common usage of both. Consider the following quotations. First, from Foucault. The notion of sex made it possible to group together in an artificial unity anatomical elements, biological functions, conducts, sensations, and pleasures, and it enabled one to make use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle, an omnipresent meaning, a secret to be discovered everywhere. Sex was able to function as a unique signifier and as a universal signified. Informed by Foucault, David Halperin writes that common rhetoric about sex and sexuality presumes that we nowadays are more or less in the possession of the facts of life when it comes to sex, and we tend to anchor sexual categories in some transhistorical reality. Turning to religion, please consider these words from Eli Barnaby, former scientific advisor to the Museum of Europe. This excerpt was displayed on a placard in a major exhibit about God and religion that traveled through North America and Europe in recent years. But what is religion, Barnaby asks. Religion, is many things. Too many things, in fact, to be confined to one definition. Beliefs and myths, practices and institutions, texts and traditions, places and itineraries, the cruelty of sacrifice and the consolation of prayer, the fraternity of the faithful and the war against infidels, figures of gods and saints, heroes and villains. It is also a power structure, a trade network, a grid for interpreting the world, a balm for the existential angst of the individual and the collectivity. Lastly, it is a symbolic system, a purveyor of meaning, hope, values, and identity. He goes on, but I'll stop there for a bit. And as a last quotation, here are two pithy sentences from Ursula King in the entry Religion from the Encyclopedia of Women and World Religion. Religion is fundamental to human experience, history, and culture, but it is difficult to define. No single, universally valid definition applicable across all cultures can be given, although many have been attempted. As is shown from these four citations, and I think from innumerable other texts and commentaries that each of us can bring to mind, a significant point about the words sex and religion is the instability of meanings attached to each one. Perhaps at present, creative confusion is more apparent in regard to sex. Although there is agreement that sex and sexual are words pointing to qualities pertaining to gender and to the erotic relationship between and among genders, not much more can be said definitively. There is not even agreement about what constitutes gender, how or if it differs from sex, or even how many genders there are. As queer theory, that is, as literature and scholarship about the complex construction of sex and gender proliferates, notions of sexuality expand further to encompass more variation and ambiguity. We are becoming increasingly aware of the fluidity and mutability of what is meant by sex and sexuality. A similar awareness of complexity and contradiction might now be developing in regard to the concept of religion, something we often speak about as having, as we do about sex. According to current, and I think significant theory in religious studies, the term religion has no consistent referent. Social and political agendas and institutions construct religion in different times and places in relation to other equally unstable concepts, such as secular and profane. The notion, expressed in the quotation from Ursula King, that there is something we can call religion that is fundamental to human experience, history, and culture, is being eloquently and effectively challenged. Such analysis is the substance of the emerging branch of theory, sometimes called critical religion. I long to study a body of work that would combine queer theory and critical religion in order to analyze and critique frameworks of thought and experience built up around the linkages of the emotionally charged and definitionally impossible notions of both sex and religion. Critique, states Judith Butler, can be understood as an interrogation of the terms by which life is constrained in order to open up the possibility of different modes of living. My talk today is an initial attempt to further both queer theory and critical religion by arguing that sex and religion have to be thought about together to advance critique in a positive Butlerian sense about each one. Even though there is a huge and growing body of academic work about sexuality and religion under the headings of women and religion, gender and religion, feminism and religion, lesbian and gay studies and religion, queer theory and religion, feminist theology, and queer and trans theology, little of it, very little of it, interrogates religion and its attendant categories, such as secular, sacred, spiritual, and divine. Almost every text about sexuality and religion shows how religious ideas and institutions termed religious influence the construction of various aspects of sex and gender while leaving so-called religious as a word unanalyzed as a term. Likewise, with few exceptions, texts within the comparatively new field of critical religion argue for the necessity of scrutinizing the historical origin and political motivation behind all religious vocabulary, but tend not to discuss sexuality as a topic of central importance to the project of critique. This silence is ironic, since, as Richard King points out, the move to denaturalize the concept of religion as a category received much of its initial impetus from the impact of feminist criticism upon the academy and its canons of knowledge. In order to frame the argument that critical religion and queer theory need one another to go places that neither has gone before, I will offer an overview of theories about religion and sexuality. My focus will be on the constraints placed on such theories in regard to their political and ideological scope and implications. The phrase feminist studies in religion is probably a good enough label to refer to the work that has so far been done about religion and sexuality. I am employing the term as a shorthand phrase, despite the fact that many scholars prefer to classify their work under one of the more precise headings I mentioned earlier. The panoply of available descriptions is one sign of the strength and diversity of the subject area. In order to point out what I judge to be the self-imposed limits of existing discourses about religion and sexuality, I will focus on distinctions between two pairs of terms, feminist theory versus queer theory, and feminist theology versus queer theology. Feminist studies in religion are based on the application of feminist theory and women's studies to the academic study of religion. The field originates in the 1970s, in tandem with what is known as the second wave of women's liberation. The first wave being generally identified with the struggle for women's suffrage in Europe and North America in the early decades of the 20th century. A significant characteristic of second wave feminism is said to be its broad scope. Instead of focusing on one issue, activists and theorists extended their reach to include all facets of life and thought that are pertinent to women's oppression. A key slogan is, "The personal is political," an axiom proclaiming that every facet of a woman's life was influenced by politics and is thus a legitimate subject for feminist analysis. There is most likely no sentence in all of feminist theory that is as important as these four words: the personal is political. It inspired critical theorists to explore spheres of life that had heretofore been considered private and personal. Since much of women's experience had been thought of as separate from public domains, huge parts of female lives had not been investigated politically. And because women's lives were relatively unanalyzed, men's lives in relation to women were also poorly understood. Feminist theory, I would say they're still poorly understood. Feminist theory opened up huge vistas for critical thought and social reform. Not only did such topics as domestic violence, sexual abuse, and wages for housework become subjects of study, but so did every idea, image, and representation having to do with women, femininity, and relationships between men and women become fair game for thorough academic scrutiny. Rich and varied expansion of critical thinking about all aspects of sex and gender continues unabated. Voila, here we are at INCISE. The intellectual energy and activist spirit of feminist theory has been a significant influence on the development of theory throughout academia. Because entrenched and seemingly eternal concepts and behaviors related to man and woman, male and female, masculine and feminine, and girl and boy, were discussed as contingent, mutable, and dependent on social and political factors, other categories thought to be universal, natural, timeless, and unchanging, such as race, body, and now religion, could be deconstructed as well. Queer theory is one expression of the radical vitality of both feminist theory and LGBTQ studies. It enters academic vocabulary in the early 1990s on the heels of Queer Nation, the creative activist movement that effectively advanced gay and lesbian political agendas. Derogatory associations to the word queer were challenged, and the term was reborn as a label for work that interrogates the production and organization of all sexuality. Dominant and so-called normal expressions connected with heterosexuality are scrutinized and deconstructed in regard to behaviors and representations labeled as marginal. That which is considered normal should receive just as much analytic attention as what is thought of as peripheral or alternative. Interestingly, the word queer is sometimes used as a verb to initiate critical thinking about concepts without an explicit connection to sex and gender. To queer something now means to begin to unmoor it from a fixed position in discourse, and thus to start thinking about it in new ways. The differences between queer theory and feminist theory are difficult to pin down. Because of the diversity of both subject matter and approaches, only observations about dominant trends can be made with any accuracy. In a general sense, queer theorists have explored and contested formulations of categories of identity connected with sexuality, while feminist theorists have concentrated on critiquing the conditions that bring about women's oppression. The subject matter of both bodies of thought overlaps considerably. Queer theorists are concerned with how cultural formations such as language and representational norms produce what we understand as sex, gender, and body. The work of Judith Butler is a cornerstone of much queer theory. In 1993, in Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex, Butler argues that bodies are made intelligible through a chain of citation that invokes and reinforces social norms by performing them. Resistance to norms is expressed when cultural conventions are performed differently, thereby altering the process of citation. Butler adheres to the post-structural position that there is no concept in culture that exists non-relationally. Because all ideas and social categories are constructed through language, they're dependent on other linguistic categories to be intelligible. For example, ideas about what male means are related to that which a culture considers female. Likewise, the word sacred can only mean anything at all in relation to a concept such as profane. Notions about what male or sacred might mean will change if and when concepts to which they are related take on new or altered meanings. Furthermore, in Butler's work, no concept is considered to be pre-discursive. That is, there is no idea present within language that has not grown out of other previous language. For example, ideas about what constitutes a family are linked to the contingencies of specific histories and social practices, rather than to unchanging nature or to essential conditions of biology. Since history and social contingency are rife with complexity and contradiction, opportunities for variation and innovation are always present. Thus, at any given moment in culture, the concept of family can refer to an array of behaviors and arrangements that can serve to support innovation. Citation of suppressed, covert, or unnoticed aspects of social practices to expand ways of living is what Butler has called working the norm. She interprets culture as rife with fissures of new possibilities in what can appear to be the solid bedrock of unyielding traditions. Some feminist theorists have disparaged queer theory for being too obscure and insufficiently concerned with real issues such as poverty or violence against women. Likewise, some queer theorists have minimized the complexity of feminist theory in regard to issues of identity, sexuality, and cultural constructions. Much more work is needed to merge these and related subfields. Hopefully, INCISE will continue to promote such discursive intercourse. The application of feminist and queer theories to religion has a rich history of variety and debate. In the last decade, a plethora of accounts about the evolution and taxonomy of the subject has become available in the form of dictionaries, encyclopedias, and textbooks. Although it is hazardous to generalize about the content of this large and growing body of scholarship, I will do just that in order to present my argument that the field is being circumscribed along conservative boundaries. Literature in the field of gender and religion is characterized by one of two tendencies. One is a passion for description, and two is an impetus to reform. The former is fueled by a desire to gather overlooked data. because women's lives within traditions and institutions termed religious have received much less attention than their male counterparts, there is a gap in information and knowledge about what religious women actually do, say, write, and think. Scholarship that describes and investigates women's religious behavior has brought to light copious material about how women cope within traditions to enhance their lives as best they can. The argument that is framed explicitly or implicitly through such descriptive work is that religion cannot be said to be either detrimental or beneficial to women in any universal sense, because women make use of religious material in highly varied and creative ways. In contrast, the feminist impetus toward reform of religious traditions is directed both toward minimizing sexism and improving women's lives. Descriptive scholarship about heretofore unrecognized women's history is mined for the purpose of discovering material that contemporary women could use to have more influence in their religious institutions and to interpret their religious heritage more advantageously. There is a wide range of substantial scholarship and theory that supports feminist reform of religious institutions and ideologies. 3 examples indicate the breadth of such work. One is a body of theory inspired by the work of Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, who cites the history of the early Jesus movement to uncover traditions of women's religious authority and resources for feminist theologizing within Christianity. She reveals precedents for the formation of what she calls woman church in the present. A second example is the work of Judith Plaskow, who urges Jewish women to understand themselves as reformers of Judaism, who are, as she says, standing again at Sinai to move Jewish tradition in more inclusive, progressive directions. In her theological writings, Carol Christ also argues for religious reform by attending to traditions linked to ancient goddesses rather than on reinterpreting established institutions linked to masculine deities and male religious leaders. Christ, along with others such as Starhawk and Z. Budapest, explains why women need the goddess on which to base an effective feminist ethics and to feel at home in the world. Like most feminist theologians, Schussler-Fiorenza, Plaskow, and Christ are interested in suggesting new ways for women to be religious. Despite the radical and highly controversial thrust of their work, each one sees herself and is seen by others as a representative of a particular religion. Feminist theology largely functions along sectarian lines, as if it were a parliament of world religions, composed of theorists and activists who are delegates standing for their own reformed and reformable traditions. Edited collections about women and religion, as well as conferences in the field, tend to be compiled and organized in accordance with the ideal of religious diversity. At times, the hegemony of Christianity is decried, with the usual result that a greater effort is made to be more inclusive in regard to other religions. Thus does feminist theology both participate and reinforce the world religions discourse that Tomoko Masuzawa identifies in the invention of world religions. Masuzawa raises a provocative and important question about this well-intentioned way of thinking, speaking, and writing. She asks whether the idea of the diversity of religion is not the very thing that facilitates the transference and transmutation of a particular absolutism from one context to another, or more specifically, is an overtly exclusivist and hegemonic version of Christian supremacist dogmatism, simply being expressed in another form, namely that of the openly pluralistic one of what's called sometimes world religious pluralism. By leaving the concept of religion unanalyzed, feminist theorists in religious studies support religion as a standardized category of identity that is natural and appropriate for women to think of themselves as having or of being. Such work does not interrogate the assumption that religion is a unique sphere of life, a thing in itself, and thus does not ask how promoting this idea influences the way women function as political subjects and agents. Instead, the favored goal is to purge religion of sexism in order to enhance it. Like feminist theologians, those applying queer theory to religion are interested in reinterpreting religious traditions in liberating directions. At present, queer thought about religion is animated by a lively passion to show how Christianity can be understood as encompassing and endorsing a wide and sometimes wild range of sexual imaginings and practices. A vivid example is Lisa Isherwood's essay, Fucking Straight and the Gospel of Radical Equality. In the anthology she edited with the late, sadly late, Marcella Altos Reed, titled The Sexual Theologian, Essays on Sex, God, and Politics. Isherwood discusses Marjorie Kemp's condition of being married to God. Kemp describes her sexual play with divinity, that Isherwood interprets as being both female and male, as more satisfying than with her husband and sire of her 14 pregnancies. In a conversation with Jesus that Kemp relates, she is told that Jesus himself wished to go to her bed as both son and husband. Isherwood concludes that Marjorie appeared to be without boundaries. She moved beyond fucking straight. This is perhaps her gift to us as individuals and her challenge to us as queer theologians, says Isherwood. While we allow the enactment of fixed binary oppositions, stable and unequal categories on our bodies through sexual stereotyping and sexual intimacy, we fail to open up the diverse, surprising wonder of radical incarnation. Fucking straight, says Isherwood, has no part in the embodiment of a gospel of radical equality. In Queering Death, in the same volume, Elizabeth Stewart argues that Christian ritual contains within it a program for the expansion of all embodied identifications. The Christian story, she writes, is a comedic drama, every act involving a dance with death, every act resounding with the laughter of resurrection, every act orientating us beyond our constructed identities, beyond our sexual desires, beyond death towards a life which is not strange to us, but experienced in every Eucharist. It is all very queer, writes Stewart. These quotations from Isherwood and Stewart exemplify a dominant objective of queer theology, to expand Christian ideas of norms about sex and indeed about all embodied experience. This is an urgent and massive political task, given the way conservative groups cite Christianity and other religions to justify oppression of persons and groups deemed to be deviant. However, deconstructing the concept of religion itself might prove to be an equally pressing objective for queer work in religious studies. In Religion Trouble, his essay about 3 anthologies that apply queer theory to religion, Mark Jordan points out how disciplinary troubles in the field of religious studies sow confusion in emerging queer-focused literature. He writes that indeterminateness about what constitutes religion in Querying Religion, a Critical Anthology, renders it difficult for a reader to judge the project of the anthology itself. Jordan wonders if endorsing an extended sense of the religious in an effort to avoid making any one religion normative is a wise strategy. Such a vague use of spirituality might prove to be complicit with the most institutionalized regimes for the production and management of selves, in the way that Foucault claimed movements of sexual liberation were. In the postscript to Gay Religion, a volume about gay communities' efforts at innovation in American religion, Jordan quotes an observation referring to an essentialism adhering to religious terminology. R. Murray Griffiths asks if the categories used in the book suggest that human beings have inherent religious impulses, instead of recognizing the social and cultural production of these kinds of needs. If queer theorists continue to use religious language without queering it, that is, if they cite religion as if it were an essential and non-political constituent of culture, they might well accomplish nothing more than a reinforcement of religious authority. Because, as Jordan says, memories of an old theocracy are tirelessly reactivated in the Christian discourses around many of us, and in the discourses of other religious regimes elsewhere. Religious terminology itself warrants thorough critique by theorists whose goal is to open up social space, traditionally policed by ecclesiastical forces. Religion Trouble foregrounds pivotal questions regarding queer forays into religious studies. Jordan notes that many contemporary writers on queer religion seem to have the desire to dethrone the hegemonic claims of privileged religions while retaining the power, the aura of the category. He recalls that Michel Foucault once suggested that discourse about sexuality was formed in the lacuna left by the death of God. The title of David Halpern's classic text, Saint Foucault Towards a Gay Hagiography, is an example of the religious rhetoric employed by queer theorists, a rhetoric indicating that queer theory occupies some of the discursive territory now claimed by theology and religion. Like Jordan, I too have noticed a tendency among queer theologians to describe their work in missionizing language. Consider this passage from Alphonse Reid and Isherwood's introduction to the sexual theologian. Queer theory, they write, impacts on theology and opens its horizons. Theology has, over the years, forgotten that it is a brave subject, and one that should lead the way as queen of the sciences. It has become self-referential and therefore cut off, afraid to look outside itself in case its own irrelevance becomes abundantly clear. Sadly, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The less it looks and ventures out, the more irrelevant it becomes. This can never be acceptable, particularly for a theology that declares incarnation to be at the heart of its reflections. Those engaged in queer theology, says Isherwood and Alphonse Reid, are stating publicly their faith in the relevance of theology in all areas of life. This declaration that queer theory is on a quest to save theology from itself indicates, like Halpern's choice of title, that the topic of sexuality has a soteriological grandeur and scope in the thinking of at least some prominent theorists. Such expressions of emotion about the calling of queer theory might intuitively underline a kinship between sex and religion that is deeper than metaphor or rhetoric. Queer is a continuing moment, movement, motive, recurrent, eddying, troublant, writes Eve Sedgwick in a passage from Epistemology of the Closet that is often cited in reference to the destiny of queer theory. The word queer itself means across. It comes from the Indo-European root twerk, that's T-W-E-R-K-W, which also yields the German queer, Q-U-E-R, meaning transverse. The immemorial current that queer represents is anti-separatist as it is anti-assimilationist. Keenly, says Sedgwick, it is relational and strange. Queer theory's future relationship to religion is indeed likely to be very troubling and strange. It will be characterized by efforts at both separation and assimilation because both fields contest the same discursive territory. Theology, in once hegemonic traditions, Jordan writes, knows something of what it is to be an urgent discourse of power over sex-linked identities. It is very possible that the linguistic and social institutions that are now identified as religions are recognizable historically and culturally because of their regulation and standardization of sex and gender. Likewise, what is understood to be sexuality might be genealogically and ideologically bound to what has been thought about religion. Sexuality and religion thus could well be discursive products of one another. Thus, if critical analysis of both religion and sexuality continues, the categories will continue to intersect, collide, and displace each other. Such adventures in deconstruction would disturb concepts that are now powerful markers of identity, as well as fundaments of public policy and government. It is not at all apparent that religious studies as an academic discipline is a site in which this sort of far-reaching theory can flourish. The idea that religion is a thing in itself, religion an sich, still animates much of the field. That the very concept of religion depends on normative constructions of sex and gender is a view that conflicts with seeing religion as separable from the to and fro of cultural movement. Furthermore, many academic units devoted to religious studies are housed in divinity schools whose mission is to train pastoral personnel committed to work within religious institutions and not to rethink the theories on which the institutions are founded. In both divinity schools and secular universities and colleges, specific denominational communities fund chairs promoting studies of particular world religions. Radical questioning of the religious categories themselves is not likely to be part of the job description of those who hold these academic appointments. Like feminist studies in religion, queer work in religious studies will be subject to similar pressures to be contained as a reformist movement within what are seen to be established religious traditions. I want to conclude with a type of case study to illustrate what I have said about the critical potential and unsettling politics involved in doing queer theory in religious studies. The groundbreaking work of Howard Schwartz shows how radical thought about sexuality and religion can open up troubling trajectories for theory. Furthermore, Schwartz's truncated academic career might serve as a cautionary tale about just how troubling such trajectories can be. In 1994, Howard Schwartz, an ordained rabbi and an assistant professor of religious studies at Stanford University, published a highly original, carefully argued analysis about masculinity in Judaism titled God's Phallus and Other Problems for Men and Monotheism. 3 years earlier, Schwartz had gained recognition for his outstanding scholarship in religious studies by winning the coveted American Academy of Religions Award for Excellence for his book, The Savage in Judaism. In his introduction to God's Phallus, Schwartz explains how feminist thought about religion had inspired him. Feminist and gender criticism, he writes, convinced me that gender is not just another subject that intersects with religion, but is central to the work that religion accomplishes and the ways in which it goes about it. I have learned to take very seriously the ways in which symbols are gendered and the way such gendered images influence conceptions of men and women. At the same time, I have found that gendered images themselves are inextricably entangled in issues of sexuality, desire, and the body. More specifically, feminist criticism in gender theory impressed me with the importance of taking seriously the gender of God. God's imagined masculinity is critical to understanding many central rituals of myths of monotheism. Schwartz's hypothesis that gender ought to be considered as a product of religion sets up a provocative agenda for theory in religious studies. His work in God's Phallus focuses on one idea that is a component of the systems labeled religions, namely that of a sexed deity. Schwartz notes that although Mary Daly and other feminist critics have elaborated the problems that a masculine Godhead raises for women, briefly, writes Daly, if God is male, then male is God. The conundrum of a male God, the conundrum that a male God poses for men themselves, remains under-theorized. Schwartz points out that although a male God functions, perhaps primarily to legitimate male power, he also generates all kinds of tensions for men and masculinity. Because it is men who are presented as being in an intimate and passionate relationship with a male God, homoeroticism, certainly homosocialism, is encouraged, homosociality would be a better way to put it, is encouraged even though myriad ancient texts explicitly forbid homoerotic acts, homosexual acts, and utilize heterosexual metaphors to describe God's bond with his people. Schwartz believes that anxiety about sexual feelings between men and a male God is expressed in several ways in both Judaism and Christianity. He interprets scriptures about veiling, disguising, and otherwise disappearing the male body of God as showing discomfort with too literal representations of God's bodily sexuality. In addition to hiding God's body, Jewish and Christian traditions have a tendency to feminize men, perhaps to make them more desirable to the Father God, or possibly to further occlude images of a more explicit homoerotic affiliation between men and God. Both traditions displace their apprehension about God's body onto women. Impregnating women is especially fraught because if God does it, human men are rendered irrelevant. However, if men do it, God is somewhat desexed and men risk being seen as unlike a sexless deity. Thus do male deities express and foster profound unease about procreation. In Judaism, Schwartz thinks this anxiety is the motivation for making the production of Torah more important than physical reproduction. In Christianity, he thinks it is key to ambivalence about both Jesus' conception and his corporeality. These are intriguing ideas about how specific ideas termed religious create basic notions about gender and sex, and accordingly how imagination about sexuality provides impetus for the construction of religious traditions. However, the ideas Schwartz sets out have not yet been widely discussed by queer theorists in religious studies. Nevertheless, it can be said that his radical and provocative text did have a notable and possibly chilling impact on the field. Howard Schwartz, whose permanent appointment at Stanford once appeared to be a foregone conclusion, was denied tenure and eventually left academia entirely. If he could have continued writing and speaking about his work on sexuality and religion, analysis of the intersections between queer theory and religion might be more advanced. In her entry titled Queer Theory in the Encyclopedia of Women and World Religion, Claudia Shippert muses about whether queering religion will be subversive and transgressive and not merely an extension of existing projects. Or will it reinscribe normalizing rhetoric? In this talk, I've argued that queer theory and critical religion need one another to creatively displace conventions of thought and practice that adhere to both religion and sex. Judith Butler, in her Afterword to Bodily Citations, a book that applies her work to religious topics, notes that whether or not God exists is a question that she has come to understand that most of religious studies sets aside. I suggest that a more important lacuna persists in the subfield of the study of gender and religion. If most of queer and gender studies about religions continues to set aside questions about the political and discursive construction of religion, that is, if scholars doing work on gender within religious studies do not ask how religion is created historically and politically as a category in intimate relation to sex and gender, the opportunity to start to think will have to be taken up somewhere else. It seems to me, says Butler in an interview with Sarah Ahmed last April, that queer has to be part of a broadening struggle. I hope today that I fueled some thinking about how such struggle might proceed in scholarship about religion. Thank you very much for your presence and attention.
So, we invite questions.
Thank you, Naomi, for continuing to challenge us to think and rethink. I want to come back to the tension between feminist theory and queer theory on the basis of the problematic or nature of the normative and the challenge to social justice that feminism wants to hold on to, and the potential dangers of losing a normative ground.
Can you think of a harder question?
It's all involved. So what I'm trying to think here really is what the connection might be when you mention in attention the relationship of Al-Rashid's indecent theology and Swartz's understanding of polymorphously perverse theology, or the potential of that. And so I wonder whether that tension between queer and feminist is really a question of, is it possible to be perverse today? Can we still have perversity in queer theory? And I think that part of it that is a question of how do we introduce any condition of normativity to challenge certain patriarchal orders, such as Trump's octopus hands.
That's immense. I guess the category of perverse should be made more specific. Maybe that would be the move to something like, what's wrong with Trump's octopus hands anyway? What would be wrong with having octopus hands? It would be, in the context that was talked about, it would be because it was intrusive, would be more specific than perversion. It would be because it was aggressive, it would be because it was violating, it would be because it was unwanted. So, just as I think the move, or at least the move that I'm trying out now, maybe in further work, is to be more specific about what we're labeling religious. Maybe it's to be more specific about what we label perverse. So it becomes, well, can you think of something that you would want to say is perverse? Trump's octopus hands?
Well, I want to try to hold the category of violation in relation to perversity.
Okay. But I wouldn't hold perversity up as some kind of ideal to find. I think I would break it down more. That would be the move I would want to make.
Yeah.
Does that make some kind of sense?
I think that is helpful to return to the specificity. And
I mean, you're looking for something like, how do we become, what norms can we set up?
Yes, and also to kind of think through what those challenges are for indecency in theology and polymorphous perverse theology.
I have no idea. I would like to get rid of the category of theology to try to think, because I think that's the, get rid of, I don't mean to put everybody out of work, but not to think of it that, not to think of somehow fitting into some idealized, institutional, and in a sense, fantasized thing. So that might be how I would want to try to approach it. Or approach an individual issue. I like thinking about Trump's octopus hands. You know, but anyway, I don't know if that gets anywhere.
Thank you, Professor Goldenberg. That was very interesting. I'm going to tie up a little bit to this question that was just asked. Is it, I could be misunderstanding, I could have misunderstood your lecture, and if that's the case, I do apologize. But isn't it the case of critical religion meeting queer theory, not rather challenging the ideas of clear-cut categories? And that includes the category of the perverse. So that it is more, rather than holding them up, looking for ideas, this is what perverse is, this is what it means to be queer, and this is what it means to be homosexual, or whatever. But looking at challenging these fictions of categories, modern liberal fictions of categories, and showing them that it is impossible to study religion without studying politics, sex, everything, and breaking down the borders, the fine lines between them, and showing them as abstruse and arbitrary. Thank you.
I think you get it. So, I like your idea of these, or the way you put it, these fictions, because that comes from the Latin facio, factus, fictus, that it's just to say something is a fiction means that it's a creation. To see these things as creations or a chimera, even they're not. They're fictions, and to see that, I think you've understood that quite well. But I don't quite get where the question is. Is there a question?
No, it was rather just a comment.
A summary.
In terms of avoiding the idea of this is what perverse is.
I don't think I would. I wouldn't want to create a perverse ideal category and then fit something in, or to call something perverse, or to call something evil. But I might. But it would be a sloppy thing to do, I think. Are we getting too abstract with it? Maybe.
Maybe we move on to another question.
Okay. Yes?
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting to me as well. It's still related to this, though, what I want to say.
I must not be getting something.
And
here.
I'm not sure if it's a question either, but as soon as I think I started understanding what the first question was about, it made me think of the old debate between regulating sexuality and rape, and whether you can consider whether you can be normative about sexuality at all. That's the Foucault feminist debate, isn't it? Because if you can't regulate sexuality, you can't say rape is a bad thing and it must not be done.
Well, you have to start with no idea about what sexuality is, right? That was one of my points at the beginning. What are we regulating?
Right.
If you're regulating whether men can penetrate women without their consent, then I think we're getting specific and we can begin to understand what we're talking about. But if we start to say regulating sexuality, creating normative sexuality, this category is as vague and problematic as the category of
But aren't
religion.
these two connected? Like if you legislate, okay, because that's regulating sexual practice, what you can and what you cannot do. the law does not say what you can or cannot think, but if you legislate, don't you create this kind of normative
Well, you create a law. You create a law.
But the law itself gets discussed, legitimized, propagandized, and so on. Does it affect issues like morality or ideology or things like that?
I actually have never understood what morality is. I've had lots of friends in ethics and tried to. I'm just incorrigible.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm asking.
Yeah, no, but to me, what's happening, which maybe is some of what I'm trying to work against, is that these things are set up as actually existing, like sexuality, like religion, like normativity, and then we have these discussions that go nowhere. But if you break the situations, if you start with the situations that are problematic and are trying to be fit into some kind of structure of regulating harm, then maybe it would get to be more specific. So I'm not sure. I think the question is somehow, how do we create norms? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think, well, the question is whether we should be creating norms, isn't it?
We probably can't stop creating norms.
I think we should.
But we probably can't stop creating norms. The object of thought, I think, would be to always be suspicious of the norms that are created.
Yeah.
To always be aware that this is a construction, a fiction,
Yes.
and to see whether it's working or not working. I think that would be
Yes.
that might be what I might have
Thank
saying.
you.
Which is actually what Freud ends up saying in Future of an Illusion, which is why he's against seeing law in terms of religious law, because he thinks it's harder to change. It's harder to see that these laws are supposed to reflect some kind of practicality, and when they seem not to, they should be changed. But if you demonize the law, if you make that norm so emotionally charged that it can't be changed, then you're in trouble. So maybe something like that is in the discussion of norms.
Okay,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
I'm happy with your answer.
Okay.
If nobody else wants to question something, maybe I can,
Mm-hmm.
from the sideline, make a question or comment. Seems to me, if we make a little game out of your title and look at queer theory meets critical religion.
I was thinking of Godzilla meets King Kong. That's where it came from.
So, if we switch that around and say critical theory meets queer religion,
Oh, I see. Take the.
and we're looking at what queer as a category of critical impulse is used for, what critical as a modifier of inquiry is used for, and where they overlap and where they sometimes produce redundancies. Then for me the real question, I mean there are some queer theories I don't necessarily agree with them, otherwise I couldn't be the director of an intersectional center for social justice, but some queer theorists, they argue against the emptying of queer from as a radical impulse that has something to do with sexualities and gender expressions and identities. So if we can understand queer in almost in a similar way as critical, where does it leave queer religion? Could almost be critical religion. So the question for me then arrives, after all the critiquing and queering and deconstructing, where do we end up? So in other words, I'm becoming more and more obsessed with investigating what maybe Foucault would call post-moral ethics. You know, we could show post-critical, post-queer impulses, not of regulation of normativities, but of some sort of pragmatics for a socially just and inclusive way of living together. And that has to do maybe with whether we should produce normativities, whether we should produce centers that create margins, or not, whether we can't produce a rhizomatic way of organizing society. So my question would be, let's take that out of the purely philosophical or critical discourse and say, well, what then? What next? Which direction is queering and critical religion taking? Is there something, what you can suggest in the intersection of this?
Another huge question of which I am in awe. I just hope it moves in progressive directions. So that's all that this is about. I see it now as moving in a conservative direction because it is not queering these theological, religious categories. So I see that as a drag on progressivism, as a drag on thinking and imagining other kinds of political affiliations. Does that help? I don't know. I mean, I have no big hope for anything, but pushing things in a more inclusive and more more inclusive, progressive direction. But that's not getting at what you want, is it?
I don't know. I think we need to reflect on things such as conservative and progressive the same way.
Well, I don't know if conservative is the opposite of progressive.
Because you used it.
Yeah.
But also progressivism from a Hegelian understanding, whether it's really useful in that sense of what queer is challenging as an impulse. And if I look at impulses in feminism and feminist thought, some things that are being propagated as progressive are decisively regressive. You know, if we have exclusivist forms of feminism that call themselves radical, but they are really regressive forms of that. We have body non-affirmative, body hostile form of feminism. So they would say, well, this is a progression. You know, so so what I'm really interested in is to say, well, once we married up to a certain degree theory and religion, because this is what we are left with when we take away queer theory and critical religion, without knowing very well what religion is, and maybe we need to clear what theory is then also, you know. But anyway, if that's what we are left with, where does it really leave us? What are the concrete steps towards a post-moral in the Foucauldian sense, society of social justice and inclusion? I'm not saying you need the answer.
I have to say I don't know.
I don't have the answer either.
Yeah, I have to say I don't know. Well, thinking about, you mentioned, I'll take a piece of it, queering theory should also be. To me, the task of queering religion, taking that apart, becomes more urgent because it is cited in law and constitutions, and because it is amorphous and because it is undefinable, but yet it's cited as if it were a specific thing there, and creating various norms that can refer to this, can be authorized through this completely messed up term. That's why I feel an urgency about that. Whereas I don't feel such an urgency about theory. Theory comes from to look at. So to look at queerly, it seems to me to be kind of innocuous, as opposed to this religion which becomes a hammer, which becomes in constitutions, which becomes something you have to protect, which becomes something you have to respect. Respect what?
So that is a way forward.
Okay.
Challenging religion as a legal concept, for instance.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think that's
my
got to be, that has to be something. I don't think you can challenge it effectively as a legal concept without challenging it in a larger sense as well.
Absolutely.
Yes, otherwise it doesn't seem to go anywhere.
Absolutely. Some more final questions? Somebody?
Oh, there's it.
Thanks. So I'm coming more from the perspective of critical religion rather than queer theory, just
Okay.
my background. I can understand particularly like the critique of queer theory and not of deconstructing religion, but from kind of perspective of where critical religion seems to be at the moment, I was wondering if you could expand on what you kind of wanted critical religion to learn from queer theory, because it already seems to be deconstructing.
No, well, there's no focus except for very few texts. I think I've written them all on on sex or gender.
Okay,
it just goes ahead. It goes ahead. It goes ahead, as if these categories that are being taken apart have nothing to do with gender. So there it is. And I can honestly say some of my best friends are queer theorists.
Yeah.
And are they listening to me? No.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's what I'm saying.
Okay, just to say this conference where I was at conference over the summer,
Yeah.
already a lot of kind of like feminist insights within critical religion, and for example, like looking at something like kink as kind of a form of religion and stuff like that. It seems to already be kind of taken on board. Is it just more okay, so it's just something that's still very much emerging within critical religion? It hasn't kind of got out there because I don't know.
What hasn't emerged?
So you're saying that kind of like critical religion isn't dealing with sexuality at all.
That's right, or gender, right?
But I don't know, I suppose that maybe it's just the conference I was at over the summer. It was very much an emerging thing.
Oh good, I wish I had been there.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, is it just a case where it just is still quite local in Britain, it hasn't kind of...
Well, I'm glad to hear that there was something happening there.
Okay.
That's good. I mean, I'm not saying it's exclusively not there, but it hasn't been at all central, which I'd like it to be, because I think that this idea that it was Anne Pellegrini, a very brilliant woman in the States, who suggested that religion might be a product of sexuality, and I thought that still fascinates me. That this, which I think it's very linked to governmentality, but I think a certain kind of governmentality is produced by an exaggeration of sexual difference, something. And I don't think it's by chance that as queer theory emerges, so too does critical religion. I think it's kind of mixed. Anyway, I don't know.
Okay, then we had a wonderful discussion, so thank you again, Naomi.
And thank you very much for questions. And, yeah.